get a plug in for our group. We're the Greensboro chapter of the National Railway Historical Society. We lease the Railway Express building, the former Railway Express building adjacent to the train station. And in that building, we have a meeting room and a library. And then next to that is the modelers, Carolina Model Railroaders. And there is a layout, and we're on our 1, 2, 3, 4, fourth layout. The current one was started in 2019. It's a model of central North Carolina extending out to the mountains and down into the Sandhills area. We are probably 40 to 50% complete, and please come by and visit anytime. As you stand on Washington Street and the train station's in front of you, it's the building to the west of the train station, and there's a small museum in the lobby. And if you go in, we're there Thursday nights, all day Saturday, Sunday afternoons. And you can see the layout and bring visitors and so forth. So we really encourage that. So that's my plug for that. I'm gonna sit down for this so I can play with this a little bit. The program tonight is about the fastest steam locomotive in the world. And many of you probably recognize this without much of an introduction, what engine that it was. And it was the fastest steam locomotive, but it still is. There's no engine that's beat its record. And in order to talk about that, we're going to talk about some other minutiae of British railroading. And I need to say that I've done a lot of research on this, but I don't know lots about British railroading. But in a lot of the programs I've done, I didn't know anything about it to begin with. I knew very little about logging. And then I did a lot of research, and I came up with a pretty decent program, and now I have a real fondness and a love for logging railroads and big trees. So, but before I get there, today, this book debuted. And this is a book about the Greensboro train station, the depot. And it comes out today, published by Arcadia Books. Those are those books that you see in all the museums and places like this. And this book has about 150 pictures of the train station and other associated nearby areas. It's $24.95. You can find it cheaper in other places. It's sold in train shops and everywhere. So please buy a copy. If you buy a copy from us, you'll have to pick it up in Greensboro because we don't sell them. We don't deliver them anyway. So a little bit about English locomotive development. If there was any picture that was a definition of contraption, this thing is. And I can't even begin to explain how this works. And the original doesn't exist. This is a reproduction. But this was the first steam locomotive anywhere in the world. And then the British were behind it. Developed in 1802. And most of you probably learned somewhere in school about the rocket, the Stephenson locomotive. And that's probably the most widely known early locomotive. The British came up with a lot of early locomotives, and they built the first one ever used in the United States. And anybody who grew up in the Northeast, you know about the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company, which later became the Delaware and Hudson Railway, which then was ultimately taken over by the Canadian Pacific Railway. But their locomotive was the Sturbridge line. It was used to pull barges in the canal near Honesdale, PA. That's northeast of the Scranton area, not far from where I worked on a track gang. And this was a Sturbridge lion. It had this lion crest on the nose of it, which you can see in this picture here, this painting. And so that was the introduction of steam locomotives in the United States. But to go back to England, after World War I, and you probably know that England was in rough shape financially after having been through a huge world war, and they had a lot of railroads that just weren't making it. So the government came along and said, okay, enough's enough. You're all going to consolidate, and came up with these 4 railroads. The Great Western in Western England, no kidding. The Southern, which has no relationship to the American Southern Railway other than its paint scheme. And the reason why it did that is Fairfax Harrison, then the president of Southern Railway, was visiting England, saw these engines, became friends with the president of the Southern Railway of England, and had steam engines painted in that color. The real English Southern Railway was near the verge of bankruptcy all the time, and we'll talk more about them later. The London and Northeast, which ran from London up the east coast of England up into Scotland, and then London, Midland, and Scottish, which was its cousin, ran northwest up from London. So after World War II, we all know that the British had another batch of financial problems, and the US and other lenders called in debts, and so they were hard pressed to come up with a lot of things that would promote better railroading, so they consolidated again. They took those 4 railroads and they created British Railways. And here you see the new emblem. There's some slang terms for that line over the wheel, but we won't go there. And on the left, you can see they're painting over the Great Western Railway emblem on the side of a truck. And that railroad persisted until 1994. British Railways persisted until 1994 when it was, politicians privatized it and made a big mess of it. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But a little bit about British steam locomotives. They had shorter trains, they had smaller wagons. This is a 10 or 12 ton coal wagon. So they didn't have a need to pull long trains and have a lot of power. You don't see articulated engines in England. You know, you see them sometimes in Europe, but not in England. And they didn't have that need. They had smaller boilers. Their output was smaller. This is a beat train, by the way. That's not rocks. It looks like rocks, but that's a beat train. And those are little 10 or 12, 10 or 12 ton cars. And a bigger car was only about 20 tons. And their equipment was hand fired. Their runs were shorter. They had multiple crews, so they weren't worrying about wearing out the firemen. And their coal was poorer quality. It needed to be hand shoveled. They experimented with automatic stokers, but it never caught on. And there was no real necessity for it. And they kept locomotives longer. They kept those little dinky engines for a much longer period of time. They had bigger engines, but the little ones were really commonplace. And I want to go through some of the interesting engines that they had. They were interesting designs, and they were beautiful paint schemes. This is just a few of them, but this is one of the very first, very successful engines, the big wheel. This was a Stirling single or a Stirling 8, because the diameter of that driving wheel is 8 feet. It was still, they could do 85 miles an hour, no problem. This is a very popular design. Here you see a picture of the crew members standing around it. And of course, the wheel looks like it dwarfs them, but English men were about 5'5" at this time in the 1870s, 1880s. So that gives you a little bit more perspective. And this just was not an oddball. This was a very successful steam locomotive. And then they started to discover, like in the United States, they started to discover those Atlantics up on the wall, like the General and the engines that were out of Promontory Point and so forth. So there were a lot of 440 locomotives. And the small ones too, 060s. This is an 060 tank engine. There were many of those for all these smaller tributaries of the railroad, short lines, things like that. And of course, they also had tender engines too, like this one here. This is just a tender version of the engine you just saw. So they were very popular. Surprisingly, we had lots and lots of 282s in the United States. Southern Railway, by the time they started ordering diesels, the majority of their locomotives were 282s. And that's true for a lot of other railroads too, but they didn't have as many of them in England. And the ones they did were fairly good sized engines. Those are probably 65-inch drivers, I would guess. Love these paint schemes. Here's a Southern Railway livery. 460 was a very popular engine design. And so this is a King Arthur class. This they name a lot of their engines. This is the Sir Lamuel. The Castle class. Okay, this is the Heidelberg Castle. Different shades of green. That's the British Railways emblem. So this is after 1948. Okay, they could do 100. Their engines were fast, just like ours. Okay, Bell pair fireboxes on a lot of them because they wanted a big firebox for hotter fires and whatnot. So Lord Nelson class, again, 460. London, Midland, and Scottish liked red engines. And so this was interesting, very colorful fleet color. And now the Pacifics come along. And those were pretty much the biggest engines that they ever had in terms of steam. Their size was generally a little bit smaller than American Pacific's, but they were pretty close. Those are 80-inch drivers on most of those. They had this one, the Flying Scotsman, which everybody has heard of. You may have known that in the 1980s, Flying Scotsman toured the United States. And if you've seen pictures of it, it's got an American headlamp up above the boiler because that was required by the Federal Railroad Administration. And so this is British Railways emblem, okay? And this is unusual because the train is named the Flying Scotsman, but the engine's named the Flying Scotsman too. So the train itself, Flying Scotsman, was pulled by other engines, but this was an engine named Flying Scotsman. And this is preserved today. It runs on a lot of excursions. It's a beautiful engine. But the ones we're here to really talk about are these, the A4 Pacifics. And we'll talk about Gresley. This is a Gresley class A4. They built 35 of them, and they lasted until 66, which is amazing. So you think about the English and steam engines lasting a long time because they didn't have a lot of money and there were some other problems that we'll talk about. But I've seen pictures of French mountain type engines in use pulling passenger trains as late as 1973 in France. So the French also had issues with funding after World War II and so forth. So here's a graphic showing a three-quarter view. And this is so interesting. This is called, look at this trailing truck right here. That's a non-pivoting truck. It's a solid frame truck. And so is the tender truck. But this is called a Cartazzi trailing truck. I'd never heard of it before. And where I got my curiosity up is I bought one of these. And I thought there was something wrong with the trailing truck until I read up on it. And it basically is a truck that floats. It just glides and it supports the cab. So this is the Cartazzi trailing truck. Here we can see it right there on the side of, anybody recognize this engine? 60163?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
What is it? This is before the famous paint that it has on it now. This is the Tornado.
Yeah.
The engine that the English built from scratch in the 1990s. This is the Tornado before it was painted in it's the colors that it is today. So other Pacifics, this is again London, Midland, and Scottish. Just an interesting streamlined locomotive. So those A4s, they weren't the only streamlined engine. So we're going to talk mainly about the London and Northeastern Railway because they had a lot of interesting stuff. And that's where this whole story comes from. And there's a map. Again, this is post-1923, a post-1923 map. That's when this railroad was created. And this railroad still exists today, but it didn't for a while. Again, the British Railways went from 1948 to 1994, was privatized, and this particular part of the railroad was bought by Virgin Railways, Virgin Airlines and Sir Richard Branson and so forth. Okay, they just couldn't make it work. And in 2018, they threw in the towel and gave it back to the government. And now it's leased to the new London and Northeastern Railway with this really neat looking paint job. So it still exists. But the LNER came up with engines like the Flying Scotsman. That was an LNER engine. And they had these chief mechanical engineers, these CMEs, who were very creative, very innovative, not just for passenger engines, but for freight engines too. And so here are the two leaders. Sir Arthur Peppercorn was the successor to Sir Nigel Gresley. So that's a whole nother story, and I have another talk about that, so we won't go there, but it was worth mentioning him. But Gresley was brilliant and came up with so many innovative designs, and this was the background of his high-performance passenger engines, these A4 streamlined Pacifics. They were all coal-fired. They were tested in wind tunnels, and that was not that uncommon at the time. They had this double blast chimney with the two openings. Okay, there are actually 4 openings that lead into those 2. It's a Kyle Chap double blast chimney. It was designed by, if you know the name, André Chapelon in France, who designed a lot of French Pacific locomotives and so forth, a brilliant guy. Their starting track of effort was pretty average. They were 71 feet long, so American Pacifics run 70 to 73 or so feet long, so it was right in that range. The English ones are just a little shorter. Drivers were 80 inches, 3 cylinders. They could do 90, no problem. They could do a lot more than 90, as we'll see. There were 35 built at the Doncaster Works, which is still there today, doing work on restoration and so forth. So again, they were withdrawn in '66. So Gresley got his design from Bugatti. And so most people are familiar with Bugatti designs like this car here, which is just unbelievable. It's L'Antique is what the name of that car is. There are only 4 of them ever made. Last one sold in 2018 for $40 million. But Bugatti also designed these motor cars for the French rail system. They were called autocars. And when we look at this, we see more about where Gresley got his ideas, because this is a Bugatti Type 32 racer. And these two never actually met, but this was a painting. This was a painting done for commemoration of the engine behind. Remember this time period, this is when design was king, and these are some of the most famous industrial designers that were associated with railroads at the time. And some of the designs were, pretty fanciful, like the one on the right, but who'd have thunk doing the design on the left? But those engines, as you know, they were built. Those are New York Central engines. So my wife always said that all these engines look like Roger Rabbit engines. And they're just too fanciful. But here's Gresley's A4. And very streamlined, looks better in color. You see the layout of the engine. Again, 80-inch drivers, it's 71 feet long. And here it is compared to a PS4 Southern Railway Pacific, just slightly larger, obviously more mechanical looking, no streamlining going on there, but just to give you a rough reference. This shows some of the internals. This is from a Gresley drawing. There's that blast pipe we talked about. These are hood doors that open up and they give you the access to that smoke box. And trying to open up that smoke box is interesting. Well, if I don't run over the top of it, I'll show you how that opens in a little bit. But there are the superheater flues, the tubes that lead into the blast pipe. Inside cylinders here, outside cylinders there. What else? This shows the cladding removed, well, actually putting the cladding on in this picture. You see the smoke box doors removed, but it looks weird to me. And so this is the first one, the Silverlink. And it was painted like a dark gray and light gray, silverish sort of color. We'll talk about these lamps later, because that's interesting. Everybody wants to know why the British don't use headlights. They do now, but they didn't for years. So here's a color picture of that same engine. Fairly rare. You don't usually see color pictures back at that time of these kinds of engines. And so these were the 35 engines, and they like to name their engines after people and places and events. And also the ones in red are all birds. So they had a number of them named after birds, including the Mallard, which is the one we're here to talk about. And the British pronunciation of that is Mallard. And so it's interesting. You may hear me accidentally say that since I've listened to this so much. Notice they had one named after Gresley, some other people, Wedgwood. Okay, and look at this, Dwight D. Eisenhower. So we'll talk about that later. And they came in different colors, depending. And the longer, the 4-digit numbers are pre-1948. The longer numbers are British Railway numbers, in case you're wondering. So there's the hood open, or the bonnet, I guess. There you can see the boiler, the access door. So there are 2 levers, and you spin one clockwise and you spin the other one counterclockwise until that door pops open. There's just a single thread and a rod that plugs into. Here it is with the cladding off. There's the Mallard. It's definitely the most famous of all the A4 designs. And I think it's one of the coolest looking locomotives I've ever seen. This is the Nigel Gresley. Let me back up a second here. these are called, they look like skirts, but they're called balances. And so sometimes they ran them with and sometimes without. During World War II, they took them off all the steam engines because it was easier to maintain them. Okay, and they wanted speed, they wanted efficiency, they didn't want to worry about that stuff. But the Gresley today still doesn't have the balances on it for whatever reason. And you can look in this cutaway, again, you can see the engine compartment. We'll talk about this cutaway right here in a little bit, but you can see the flues here, there's the blast pipe, and the cylinders, inside, outside cylinders. The buffers right here, which are characteristic of railroads outside the United States. Another cutaway, you can see the distribution of the coal and the water. Again, there is the boiler. And this exploded picture just gives you a little different view. That was kind of unusual. I just had to include it, even though it's kind of a jumble. I love all the brass. And so you get in the cab of one of these and there's just brass everywhere. Like, that's more characteristic of UK and Europe. And so here you want to make it go. So here's the release handle right here. You open the drain cock, which is, where the heck is it? There. Okay, the fireman opens the drain cock. Remember, this is an English locomotive, so the driver sits on the left, the fireman is on the right, with the fire crew. You blow the whistle, there's the whistle. You release the brakes, there's B, and then you're watching the brake gauge while you open the throttle, there's A, okay? And you're monitoring the boiler pressure up here, okay, and the steam chest pressure, which is F, and I've lost F here, but it's somewhere in here. Okay, you can tell I would be great as a steam engine driver. The injector and boiler water gauges, H and I, right there, okay? And there is they call it the fire hole, but we all call it the firebox. Okay, and again, that's manual stoking. Okay, so this was a big publicity thing. Everybody wanted to, this is, we're talking about 1930s, and so unlike America, where everybody was starting to buy cars and they were putting the trolley car companies out of business and so forth, everybody was driving everywhere. That didn't happen so much in Europe and England because people, if you remember, you see old pictures of there, a lot of people are still on bicycles. And so there wasn't that kind of need for it, but a lot of people rode trains. And so that was a big publicity tool. We can get you there faster than the next company can. And so the record at that point was a German railroad, I think it was Deutsche Bahn, was 124.5 miles an hour. So Gresley got together with the president of the LNER and they decided to pull a stunt. They were gonna run a train as fast as it could possibly go and break every record. And so they chose an area in eastern England, not far from Birmingham in Lincolnshire. And they had 6 passenger cars and a dynamometer car. If you're not familiar, a dynamometer car measures track speed, what the engine performance is and so forth. And they can verify this because at the time they kept this recorded with a tape drive. And so they didn't want any mistakes. They wanted to be able to prove what they had done. And Gresley didn't tell anybody but the fireman and the engineer until the day that they did this. Then they told the rest of the crew what we're gonna do today. And so they took this train down Stoke Bank and they kept it at 125 miles an hour, and then for a mile, they got up to 126 miles an hour. Initially in the papers, it's reported as 125, but it's verified to be 126. And later they said they could have gotten up to 130. But there was a curve coming, and they needed to slow for the curve. But when they slowed for the curve, they unfortunately damaged a bearing. But in 3 days later, it was back on the tracks again, so it wasn't serious damage. And this is a photo of it at some point in that journey. And there's the dynamometer car, and there are the passenger cars. This is 4468, that was Mallard. This is the crew. This is the engine driver, Joe Duddington, and his fireman right here. And here they are looking at the information coming out of the tapes in the dynamometer car. That was the dynamometer car. It still exists today. It's at the Railway Museum in York, north of London. And that's what the guts of it look like. And This is what the wagons look like. They're teak, and they are just really neat looking. That wood is unbelievable. It stands up to all kinds of harsh environments. So this is it looks almost like a guard's compartment, but I don't think it is. I think it's a baggage compartment.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
What does in the rake mean?
Oh, I'm sorry. In this country, we would call it, the rake would be called the consist. It's
I see.
It's the cars in the train, I should have said. Yeah, it's a British term. There's a marker today at the place where this happened. This is a modern day picture, 126 miles an hour, 1938. And right after that, if you remember the changeover in the King of England, Edward abdicated the throne and his brother became King George VI, and that happened in 1937. This train was named the coronation for Edward VI's coronation. And this was a booklet that they put out. They named one of the trains the coronation. And this was an advertising booklet, and it showed you where the train went. It went from King's Cross in London to Scotland, and there was a layout. You could see what car you were going to book and so forth. It was a train that ran for years, and it had meals and everything else. I don't have the whole booklet. There's the route. Interesting enough, I found this booklet in our library in Greensboro, in our railroad library. So this was the tail car for the coronation train. It almost looks more like that Bugatti auto car that I showed you. Kind of interesting looking. And then this all is kind of winding up because we know steam's not going to last forever, just like it went away in every other country. But again, we talked about financial effects of World War II. They started developing new diesels and new electric locomotives. They had terrible dependability problems with them. And this lasted for a long time. So I don't know if you know anything about current railroading in England, but the most popular freight engine in England right now is a class 66. It's a long diesel. And anybody know who it's made by?
EMD?
That's right. It's made by EMD in Muncie, Indiana. Really, there are 500 of them. And it's a 6-axle, basically it's an SD40-2 that's longer. And there was a lot of grumbling when its predecessor, Class 59, came out in the mid to late 80s. Why do we have to buy American engines? The British can build engines, blah, 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 blah. The availability of English diesels and electrics at that point was not more than 60%. The American availability of Class 59s and later the 66s was 95%. And after a few years, everybody just shut up. So it's so interesting. But anyway, and they rebuilt engines, and I have to go on another story out in the weeds. So my father-in-law, he owns a coal company, a stripping company in West Virginia, and they ran equipment until you just couldn't run it anymore. Dozers, drag lines, things like this, just wrecked it. There was nothing left of it. And he said back after World War II, the Germans would come over and buy all that stuff and take it back to Germany and rebuild it. It was still worth rebuilding, and we would never consider doing that in the United States. It was too expensive. Well, same thing, in the US for railroads, we wouldn't keep rebuilding engines, but the British did. They did it over and over again. So there was that issue, and they were rebuilding engines that looked like, Tunerville trolley kinds of engines and still using them into the 60s. But that's because they were trying to be financially conservative, and they didn't have the money to do it otherwise. So last run with this engine, you can see they dumped the fire. And somebody wrote on the front, last run, the end, blah, blah, blah. So they started moving away from steam engines. And they started building things like this warship class engine, which was a colossal mess. And by August of '68, no more steam on main lines anywhere. And the scrapyard started filling up with steam engines, lots of steam engines. So this is the most famous one, Woodham's in Bury, which is in kind of central southern England. And look at this, unbelievable. And I gotta make a comment, because this picture is so goofy. People think rail fans are goofy, but this picture is really goofy. I gotta say, when I was in Portland once, I climbed all over Doyle McCormick's PA1 with his blessing, but I was at a meeting across the river, and I was wearing a blue sport coat, white pants, and white suede shoes. And he said, "You didn't really come here dressed for this, did you?" Well, it wasn't any worse than these guys.
You matched the colors though of the PA1.
I did. I did not get a mark on my clothes. So in Britain, they're called train spotters, and they're considered to be kind of eccentric and goofy. But it's a national epidemic. I mean, look at here, gangs of school kids out watching trains, and they're marking down the trains. They've gone to see every single member of a class and mark it down in their little books. That's a train spotting book. They showcased this engine. 25,000 people turned out for it. So they're just gonzo over trains there. Trains magazine said there are about 175,000 rail fans in the United States. In the UK, it's 1 in every 10 males.
Wow.
And these, if you model railroad and all, you know, you can buy little HO figures of rail fans and put it on the trackside. If you go into kiosks or book stands in the train stations and other places in England, and for that matter, Germany and Switzerland and other places, I mean, just packed with railroad books, just tons of them. So they have a different outlook. So this is the most famous picture of these discarded engines, because somebody wrote on it, "Please don't let me die," with the crying eyes and the downturned mouth. That made the news everywhere. And pretty soon rail fans started showing up at Woodham's and the other places and started buying up these engines. And the guy that owned Woodham's was very liberal with them. And one thing he did is he scrapped all the freight cars first, because he could still get money for the steel, and he left the engines for the rail fans if they could pay for them. And they were running at the time, depending on their condition, $4,000 or $5,000 up to maybe $8,000. That was the scrap value. And he cut him a lot of breaks on this, and he's been interviewed on TV and whatnot as to why he allowed these people to come in and do all that. And so here it shows rail fans showing up and picking up these engines and carting them off and spending years and years and years refurbing them. And even the "Please Don't Let Me Die" engine was rescued in 1985. It's a Stanier Class 8F 280, and isn't it gorgeous? I mean, it is a beautiful engine, and it runs on excursions constantly. They saved 6 of the Gresleys. Those are the ones that were saved up here. Unfortunately, Silverlink was scrapped. Here's a picture of it in the scrapyard. And then there were a lot of these tourist and railway fan little railroads that started just popping up everywhere. I mean, isn't that cute? Look at that color scheme. And here's one of those teak cars that we talked about, double heading these little scooters. And they cover the country. And it's amazing. Look at this. Now, tell me, you know what this is? You recognize it? It's not a British engine. Look what it says on the tender.
USA.
This is a U.S. Army Transportation Corps 280 from World War II.
Like a Lend-Lease locomotive?
Yeah, one of the Lend-Lease locomotives that ended up in England and never came back over. And they painted it up like a British locomotive, but it says U.S. Army Transportation Corps on the side. So they'll run anything over there. So this shows, look at how many heritage railways there are that are running trains, okay, compared to the U.S., okay? We have 133 tourist railroads plus 50 railroad museums that operate trains. But consider the population, 332 million people in the U.S. compared to 67.5 million, and the geographic size. So there's a rail operation behind every tree in England. and this is that tornado engine, which you probably saw a lot of publicity about the last 20, 25 years or so. Named after the Tornado jet fighter that was being used in the Persian Gulf at the time that they proposed this engine. And that has the trust name on it. And this is being built right now, being built from scratch. It's a 282, And they estimate that it's going to cost about $8.5 million, but the tornado ended up costing about $5 million, if I remember correctly. So this is what it looks like. It's gonna be called the Highlander, the 3403. So what's the deal with indicators on the front end of locomotives? They say that they don't need headlamps to drive an engine. By the time they see something in their headlight, they've already run over it. And what it is they'll have a lamp or a white circular plate on the front of the engine to denote what kind of train it is. Is it a high-speed passenger, local commuter train, local freight? Is it a mineral train? And it just depends on the placement of the indicators, okay? That's what that stands for. This is Mallard today, preserved. It's only cosmetically preserved. It actually hasn't run since 1988, but it looks gorgeous. And it's got a plate on the side that documents its speed. It's had 12 boilers since 1935, but they've got them out of weather 84s. And at times, they've run it with this tender. And what's that? It's a door in the back of the tender, because it's what they call a quarter tender. When they're making long runs, they're going from London, well, even south of London, all the way up to northern Scotland. There's a door in the back and there's a corridor that goes alongside the bunker. And it's so they can run extra crews. So one crew runs the train for X number of hours and goes to sleep in one of the crew cars, the dorm cars, and the other crew comes up and they take over. So they don't have to mess around with changing crews and things like that. In 2012, they brought all the existing ones together, including they brought the Dominion of Canada over from the museum in Montreal, and they brought the Dwight Eisenhower from the Green Bay Museum. They cosmetically fixed them all up, and this shows, and they did it again in 2018, but they only had they minus the Canadian and American ones.
And just make a comment that, 10 days ago, 1 year and 10 years ago, the Mallard was here. And we saw it out on Stratford Road.
Which Mallard was it? Was it the Eisenhower?
Yeah,
Okay, I didn't know that. That's neat. I would love to have seen it.
it was here on Stratford Road. And
Because maybe they would have been coming back from
it was coming,
England.
no, it was coming back on tour.
Really?
It was back on tour with the US because I saw it.
Wasn't that put on by a guy named Pegler, Alvin Pegler or something like that?
Yeah, Alan.
Oh, I don't
Alvin
know.
Pegler?
And that's where it came from.
Once in a while, they'll tow it from other events. Here it's being towed by the tornado. Here's it's being towed by the only operating A4, which is the Nigel Breslin. Okay. And I'm gonna finish up by tickling your fascination with all these signs they've got on all these locomotives. Look, there's just a wall full of them. This is at York at the Railway Museum. And they'll put these signboards on the front of the engine. They'll name the engine with little signs here, but they've got such interesting things. I thought this was just a cool looking engine. Weird by American standards, but the paint scheme, you can't beat it. And this is the city of Truro, that's the name of it. And then they might add another headboard up here that would have the name of the train. Okay, the Joe Blow Express or whatever. And look at, this was a few months ago when King Charles went through his coronation. And this is a Class 37 diesel, which was developed back in the 60s. But there's the headboard. And you can buy all this stuff for your models. All this stuff is available. And you can buy beer too. You can buy Mallard beer, but you have to call it Mallard. And then there's unbelievable artwork that's out there. That's just, the design of these engines just gives to the flow of artwork. But then, sometimes that is used for all kinds of other things. I mean, here, obviously, they're using it to market industrial products.
Awesome.
This is
Nice.
a cardboard fold-out model. This is made out of coal. If you've seen stuff in West Virginia, it's common to see this kind of stuff in gift shops made of everything. Then there's this, which certainly has to be the most unusual monument to railroading. That is all brick.
That's not blowing away in the wind.
It's not going anywhere. Imagine how many bricks there must be. This, you know, it's a tea kettle, right? It went in auction recently for almost it was over 900 pounds, which is about $1,300. There's mine. This is on the layout in Greensboro, and with my teak coaches. And there's the 2 lanterns indicating that this is a high-speed passenger train, get the heck out of my way. So, anyway, I hope you enjoyed that.